In the 18th century, when it all began, an overwhelming majority of Europeans tended to live in the countryside. It is estimated that in Eastern Europe, about 90% of all the people lived in the countryside and were associated with their occupations like agriculture and animal husbandry. Western Europe, which was relatively more developed in terms of commercial and urban organization, it is estimated that not more than 25 to 30% of the people at any one point of time lived in the towns. In terms of the cities that actually existed, if one looks at the amenities that went with it, not many things that one normally takes for granted in urban life today used to feature in 18th century Europe. There were problems to do with health and hygiene, there were problems of sanitation, and all other sorts of medieval hangovers of a number of people living in a dingy place, heavily concentrated, heavily populous, was fairly regular. Even transport used to be fairly primitive. It used to be said that it was easier to commute between two countries rather than a country to its countryside. This entire picture changed almost entirely within the next century. As the towns began to grow in size and a large cluster of urban conurbations began to develop all across Western Europe, and mere small towns or even villages in Britain and France began within a course of a decade or two to transform into large urban conurbations. The dramatic change that this came to signify in European life revolved primarily around the changes in industrial economy. A large number of factories and workshops began to grow, which relocated the main frame of production, industrial production, from artisanal houses, the cottages of the artisans who were actually involved in the labor that goes into the making of an industrial product, to a workshop which is invested in, where the capital is provided by a merchant, and where people come to sell their labor rather than their skill. The changes that followed as a result in European society have variously been identified as either the beginning of the modern capitalist order or even as beginning of modern society.
The fall of Louis Philippe was followed by the organization of a massive demonstration in Mannheim. It continued to spill over into various other areas, and gradually various states of Germany had been affected. Germany, we know, had been a federation of 38 states, large and small. Prussia was the largest. There was a very great movement in Baden, a popular movement which demanded constitution, civic rights, and freedom of the expression. Most of the states, except the larger states of Bavaria, Hanover, Saxony, and Prussia, accepted the demands of the popular movements for civic and other legal rights, for a constitution which had been granted. Later, the liberals were able to secure concessions even in these states. In Bavaria, for example, the King Ludwig was forced to abdicate after a scandal involving the Anzieu's Lola Montes had come to light. Frederick William of Prussia, he summoned the Landtag, the Prussian Landtag, but when it refused to grant money that he demanded and to grant him loans, he prolonged the session. Frederick adopted a stern attitude in the beginning, but the fall of Metternich in Austria made a tremendous impression on him, and he had to agree to convene the Landtag, to introduce a constitution, to promise reforms, and also assuring them that he would try to reorganize the German Confederation and strive for greater unity. The initial success encouraged the nationalists and the liberals to work for German unity. German nationalism, as it were, was awakened to a new life. There had been movements for constitutions were granted in various states, some liberal reforms were conceded, but that did not constitute the sum of what the revolutionaries or people involved in the movements might have wanted. It is important to remember that apart from the liberal and the national ideas, there was a strand of radicalism as well in Germany. It might be helpful to remember that Marx and Engels, for example, were active in Rhineland, which was part of Prussia. Marx highlighted in his newspaper, Rheinische Zeitung, the strike by the Silesian weavers. When this was stopped, he and Engels were collaborating, say from mid-1840s. They had set up their Communist League, were beginning to preach socialist ideas involving the working classes. And we know in 1848 they brought out the Communist Manifesto, which purported to be the agenda or the manifesto of the Communist League they had set up. So far as nationalism was concerned, there was a demand, and now a central parliament was called on the basis of popular election to Frankfurt. Earlier, the Central Diet had members who were nominated by the rulers. Now the members of the Frankfurt Assembly were elected by the people from the various states. It had a total of 586 members, and most of the members were liberal intellectuals. In this assembly, several ideas of what the future of Germany was likely to be, or what future German nation would be, had been thrown up. For one thing, there were the ideas of a Großdeutsch and Kleindeutsch, Greater Germany or Little Germany. The Greater Germany would have included all the German-speaking ideas, and that was the demand of some people, whereas others felt that it was not within the realm of practical politics, because Austria was bound to oppose any idea of German unity by the Germans themselves. Therefore, they opted for Kleindeutsch or Little German solution, which would exclude Austria from this federation. The draft constitution was proposed by the historian Dahlmann, but it failed to secure unanimity. After long, hair-splitting discussions, in which they spent time and energy on such issues as whether to call the Central Assembly Bundesstaat or Staatenbund, a play on words rather than on substance. They decided to have a united Germany, but would it be Republican? No. Ultimately, they were bereft of ideas, and they offered the throne of unified Germany to the King of Prussia. The King of Prussia refused to accept it on two counts. A, he represented a tradition of centralized autocratic monarchy, and therefore to accept the crown from an elected assembly would have been a very bad thing, and he couldn't have, because this would limit his power, and he was not likely to do this. Second, it would have involved him in a conflict with Austria, and Prussia was not yet prepared for this. Therefore, when the King of Prussia refused to accept the crown, the Frankfurt Parliament's work seemed to have come to total nullity. They did not have an alternative contingency plan if the king were to refuse this. And it seemed that attempts at uniting Germany in 1848 had failed, and had failed irrevocably. By this time, the conservatives had recuperated their power. There had been massive demonstrations in Berlin and other places in October, violent clashes. But by early 1849, the conservatives had recovered from the early shock and were regrouping themselves. Therefore, the movements gradually kind of dissolved themselves. The Prussian king now decided to take the initiative and unify Germany in other ways if he could do that. And he failed to do that as well, because again Austria was the stumbling block. Austria had by 1849 also recovered from the shock, and we know through Russian help it had brought the entire Habsburg Empire under control, and Austria was in no mood to allow Prussia to unify Germany by excluding Austria. And therefore, when there was possibility of a war, finally Prussia climbed down, signed what has often been called the humiliating convention of Olmütz, and decided to continue the German Confederation as before. The hope of the German liberals for a really liberal constitution had been disappointed. Though the King of Prussia granted a constitution, it was not really what the liberals wanted. One answer that some historians have put forward is very simplistic, that the revolutionaries were not really good revolutionaries. They were not effective. They did not provide effective leadership. They were full of big ideas but did not have enough practical sense. The failure, however, should not be attributed specifically to this kind of personal failure. It is to be seen in the context of the specific socio-economic circumstances in different areas of Europe or in different countries of Europe. For one thing, the middle class leadership was half-hearted because of the presence of a defined socialist and working class movement. They were afraid, the middle class leadership was afraid, that if the movements were allowed to be radicalized by the people, then the revolutions could be taken to other, not entirely desirable directions. Now, therefore, they were not averse to a compromise. This explanation was first put forward by Marx and Engels contemporaneously. In fact, Engels very famously wrote that the lower middle class particularly had been torn between the expectation of climbing up the social ladder and the fear or anxiety of being pushed down it all too soon. He and Marx were trying to explain the support of these people for, say, Louis Napoleon in France, which ended the revolution in France. The republic was again hijacked by Napoleon later and transformed into an empire. They were trying to understand this. And as even, this point has been accepted, elaborated and rejected by later historians. But as a recent historian, Jonathan Sparber, has put it, I'm quoting him, 1848 was the revolution that fell between two stools, the bourgeois of 1789 and the proletarian of 1917, unquote. As I said, this is a point which has not been accepted by everyone. They had argued that it's difficult to talk in terms of a very well-defined working class now. The working class had a very weak presence in Central and Eastern Europe, which had not really witnessed industrialization. Now, the kind of people who were involved in this working class movement were masters, journeymen, craftsmen, artisans. They said they were somewhat like the sans-culottes of 1789 rather than a really defined working class that one would identify with the results of the Industrial Revolution. In 1849, nationalism was an important issue, but then nationalism was unifying but also a divisive force. We have seen this earlier in the context of Hungary, that while the Magyars were very, very emotional and passionate about their nationalism, they denied such rights to other smaller nationalities within Hungary. Now, this division among the various nationalities was something that the conservative ruling class was able to exploit and come back to power. The conservatives, it has been suggested, had also learned their lessons from 1789 and were determined to strike back. They very skillfully exploited the weaknesses amongst the revolutionaries and were able to come back. But even with this failure, it's possible to suggest that the radicals, the leftists we might call them, they did organize and use new slogans to attempt a revolution in 1848. They failed, but the attempt was significant as it showed the way for the revolutions of 1848 has been called the springtime of the people, and like spring, it proved to be transient. The year 1848 has been seen as a climactic point in the process of rapid socio-economic development and political change that Europe had witnessed since the French Revolution of 1789. Liberalism, nationalism, as well as social issues played a very significant role in most of these revolutions. But the failure of liberal and national aspirations were noticeable in Germany, Italy, and elsewhere. It is important to remember that the revolution had really been effected in two stages. The first stage was characterized by the desire for national unity and for liberal institutions. But when there were fresh clamors of liberal outburst in June days in France, in Paris, and later in Berlin, Vienna, and other urban centers, there was a strong association of the working classes and the poorer classes in these movements. For example, I would cite a few figures. In Berlin, 300 people died, of whom only 15 belonged to the educated classes, and 30 were skilled artisans. In Milan, in the clashes, about 350 people died. Only 12 of them were intellectuals and non-workers. And therefore, it is not wrong, if we look at these statistics, to suggest that working class people, whatever their character, had been involved in this in large number, and it is these people who had sacrificed their lives during the more radical phase of the revolution. However, there were certain permanent gains. For example, serfdom had been abolished in many places, and this abolition proved to be permanent. Seigneurial dues, or what remained of the seigneurial dues, had also been abolished, and even that abolition was permanent. The sudden end of feudalism marked the beginning of progress in both agricultural and industrial sectors in much of this region. The progress of industrialization and rapid demographic growth indeed produced the new class that we've been talking about, whose significance was appreciated even in 1848. Tocqueville, for example, Alexis de Tocqueville, the French politician, author, historian, he wrote that the working class was astir, and the chief aim was no longer a political revolution but a social revolution. This is very important that one is talking of social revolution. Later, Hobsbawm, a noted English historian, he noticed the presence of working class in almost all the countries where revolution had broken out in 1848. And this class was not interested in just political change. They sought some kind of a social transformation. Apart from this social question, if we look at the political, particularly the national question, we have seen that nationalism failed to have much headway in Germany or Italy. Now, in Italy, what happened has been described by Gramsci as a passive revolution. Again, I'm quoting from Gramsci. Quote, "What was involved was not a social group which led other groups, but a state, Piedmont, which, even though it had limitations as a power, led the group which should have been leading," unquote. This is what he calls a passive revolution. That the popular movements failed, and in future Italian national unification was achieved by the state Piedmont under the leadership of Cap. It's important to quote Namier. I'm quoting him. Quote, "The year 1848 proved in Germany that union could not be achieved through discussion and in agreement, that it could be achieved only by force, that there were not sufficient revolutionary forces in Germany to impose it from below, and that therefore, if it was to be, it had to be imposed by the Prussian army," unquote. This is exactly what happened later, and Namier may well have been inspired by what actually happened to draw his conclusions for 1848. Finally, it has been suggested that 1848 was a turning point in which European history failed to turn. Now, it is possible to elaborate this by suggesting that it was indeed a turning point when Europe failed to turn if what was on agenda had been shelved for all time to come. If on the other hand it is argued that what was sought and attempted in 1848 were gradually achieved later, then 1848 could be seen as a premature attempt rather than as a total failure. And indeed, in 1848, the new regimes which had been created in certain areas had vanished by 1851. But as we have noticed earlier as well, many of the changes which had been established had been permanent. For example, the ending of the feudal obligations of serfdom and forced labor in the Habsburg Empire for one. There were other and more latent kind of successes which were suppressed by in 1849 but only gradually emerging or re-emerging in course of the next decades. Socialism had certainly been important, very marginally important in 1848, but in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, socialism grew and socialist parties emerged in most countries. So it anticipated the future rather than achieved immediate result in 1848. Kossuth's republic or the Hungarian autonomy had collapsed with the revolution, collapsing of the revolutions in 1849. But in 1867 came the Ausgleich, or the agreement that actually created or transformed the Austrian Empire into the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The revolutions of 1848 to 51 at a level did change the political life of Europe. It was probably not in the manner that the revolutionaries had intended, or either the conservatives or the reactionaries had predicted. But 1848 did constitute a watershed. It had been an year in which Europe The whole of Europe virtually was astir. We had seen earlier that England, it is usually believed, had been out of this, but England had the Chartist movements. Liberalism, nationalism, radicalism, even socialism were all some important ideologies. They had inspired these movements. People were involved. The middle class and intellectuals provided leadership everywhere. Now all this constituted the strength as well as the weakness of the revolutions of 1848.
To conclude, one needs to make this one final point, that the historians' approach to whether the transformation was revolutionary or evolutionary depends on which particular society, which particular economy was looking at. American and British historians like Clapham, Neff, Dean, Hobsbawm, Landis, focusing primarily on the case study of the British industrialization and looking at the dramatic breakthrough, insisted that this was a revolutionary transformation. By contrast, people like Creda and Gerschenkron, looking at the continental cases, were more concerned with the continuities that could be noticed in terms of industrial evolution over the 2 centuries that went before, and they insisted that the transformation was not quite revolutionary. It was much more general and as a part of a general trajectory that happened. So the break that did take place was not actually a revolutionary break, it was merely an acceleration. It was a break in terms of the scale rather than the quality of the change that